Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth event in the Nightlight Poetry Reading Series. My name is Tom Snarski, and I'm delighted to be here with you this evening. It's only 4:30 here, but the way the sunsets have been going, evening feels kind of apt still. And I'm hosting a brilliant pair and exciting musical guest of readers this evening. If you have not listened in before, Nightlight is a reading series that features poets and writers, new and established, in a monthly reading that we usually host virtually via Zoom now on the third-ish Thursday of the month, usually at 9 p.m. Eastern, but occasionally we shift it around a little bit like we are today. Having these events every month means that we are always looking for folks who might be interested in reading. So if you are or know a poet or writer who'd be interested in sharing their work at a future event, please get in touch with us. We love to hear from new folks and make new friends of the series. We're on Twitter at Nightlight Poems, NIGHTLIGHTPOEMS, and we're on Instagram at night_light_poems_. You can also just get in touch with me directly. I'm Tom Snarski at TOMSNARSKY on Twitter or Instagram, or you can just email me at tomsnarski@gmail.com. And I'm really particularly excited about this event in the Nightlight Reading Series because part of the conception of Nightlight was, in addition to being a reading series, also to be a conversation series where, when time allows, we can make some space to invite our readers to share more than just their poems. As part of tonight's reading and musical event, because we're going to hear from one of our readers and special musical guests in more than one medium, which I'm very much looking forward to, we'll also have a time at the end for a Q&A where our readers who work in poetry, but also these other genres, will be able to share a little bit more about their whole practice with us. I have a few questions prepared, but our live Zoom audience who you're seeing right now will be welcome to join in via the chat when we get there. So without any further ado, I'm just going to shift the little view here really quick. I think I know how to do that quickly. Da, 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 da. And now that I've done this handy dandy button press, I'm going to introduce our first reader, who is Tim Rich. Tim is a writer and ghostwriter based in the seaside town of Hastings in southern England. His work is included in the book Dark Angels, 3 Contemporary Poets, published this year. He also shows his poetry and lo-fi photographs shot on iPhone together at exhibitions online and in magazines. Tim, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Feel free to unmute yourself when you're ready, and the floor is yours.
Tom, thank you so much. Big thank you for inviting me on tonight. I am delighted to be here. And very nice to see some new poetry names on the Zoom and also some familiar faces from around the world. So hello, good evening to everyone. So as you said, I'm coming to you from the town of Hastings. For those that don't know, chiefly famous for 2 things. One, being invaded by the French in 1066. And second, this is sort of the birthplace of television. First experiments took place here. So you can thank us for keeping up with the Kardashians and other cultural treasures. So greetings from Hastings on a sort of wintry night. My first poem is from the book that you mentioned, the beautiful book, Dark Angels, 3 Contemporary Poets. Brilliant that Therese, one of the other authors, is here this evening, and it's absolute pleasure to be in the book with her. The first poem I'm going to read from you, I was also really keen for it to be the first of my poems in my section of the book. And that's because it's about the relationship between a writer and a reader, this incredible, intimate connection that happens, this extraordinary transfer between one mind and another, of ideas, of thoughts, of emotions and sensibilities and atmospheres. And I sort of see it as a kind of humanist miracle that happens. And I think when you work with words and you're immersed in the world of words, sometimes you can kind of forget, you can become a bit familiar with the process. And I think it's good to sort of defamiliarize ourselves sometimes with what a miracle this act is. So this first poem is a celebration of that. It's called Lines. We can go anywhere, right? you and me on this common ground, this pale Nazca plain we approach from different hills to meet and make sense of what we think we feel. Our bodies are gripped in the shoes of the earth, but we can always rise, just as dust finds warm ascent, to return like hummingbird feathers, held light in the morning air's careful child hands, falling softly towards the grace of meaning. And we can go anywhere, right? Me and you. This second piece is about my increasingly confused relationship to the natural world, and both the natural world and wild nature out there, and also the wild nature within me. It's called The Extinction of the Wild Bears of Ireland. A man who sounds full of sunlight is on the radio, talking about the extinction of the wild bears of Ireland. To be honest, I wasn't paying much attention, but that line, the picture it drew, two wild bears, earth brown, both taller than a van, each eye glinting like water in a well, noses raised towards an uncertain evening, and all about some rain-fresh world of velvet meadows, firethorn blessings on claw-marked path. And yet, my mind doesn't go far until it runs into earthworks, gates, enclosures, bears prowling outside a long garden wall. A van, a well. It's like my imagination was born in a stable and my thoughts remain gathered within a field. Is there really anything wild left in any one of us? Is there some inner terrain holding the enormity of a wilderness? Oh, but that voice again, is his name McMahon, strolling across such distance, nearly singing to us now of the animals' retreat into mountain caves, the thick bones found huddled about themselves, telling us that something important died therein. I try again to imagine before. Unbordered land, bears smashing into oil-fat salmon, resting in a roll-around nest of gorse and sage, cinnamon light warming the last of the bilberries, nameless birds, noting shifts of power in the hair-quick wind. I see it all, but perhaps this land is too free for me to truly know. And I worry that my bears will soon accept an apple from the tree. So one evening recently, I was having a really boring conversation with myself about the exciting topic of personal data and how I was feeding more and more and more of my information into the virtual world out there. And I just suddenly began to feel kind of exposed, like I just reached this moment of concern and lack of trust. And I sort of felt like out there on the internet lives this digital twin of me. And it was a really strange experience, a strange moment. And a little bit later that day, I had a much more interesting conversation about ancient Egypt, and particularly the life of the god king Osiris. And that night, I ended up having a kind of fever dream about personal data and ancient Egypt and the internet and Osiris. And the next morning, this poem emerged. Now, listen, I'm aware that not everyone is completely conversant with the intimate details of the life of Osiris. So here is a super quick summary of his life. I'll try to do it in 40 seconds. So Osiris was a god king of ancient Egypt and a very successful ruler. Unfortunately, his brother Set, or Seth, was deeply envious, so much so that he murdered him. In fact, he didn't just murder him, he had his body cut into pieces and they were scattered across Egypt. But Osiris's wife, Isis, toured across Egypt in search of every last remnant of her husband's body until she had the last piece. And she brought them all back together and sang beautiful incantations of love over the body until he was united with himself and resurrected, probably the word to use. So that is a preface that's quite a lot longer than the poem I'm just about to read, which is called Osiris is Slain and His Remains Distributed About the Internet. I am being scattered as information across the desert nightlands of our transactional universe. In the sand and in the reeds are lost shards of me, data seeds cast by the side of the path. There is so much of us we let go, things I've forgotten about myself, and there are parts of you here too. Now come the harvesters, extracting the crop, so to sell us back a replica of our wholeness. All these corporate gods pretending to be Isis when they're really the children of Set. I'm going to lift the mood slightly. And I'm not going to do a preamble for this one. I think I'm just going to read it. And if it resonates with anyone, then let's talk about it in the conversation later. I'm just going to take a swig of beautiful Hastings tap water. This poem is called Shade. So came the moment we discovered animals had gods too. Some shaped as them, claws, tails, humps, horns, fins. Others more like sea mist folding into itself. Information came quickly that the creatures were one by one finding ways to share their stories of faith. Turns out birds don't see us as superior beings, more ambitious reptiles negotiating shared paths. Instead, we learned the avian spirit world is found beneath the earth's warm skin, deep in a believed infinity of mud, where blind shadows fly upside down, rising towards our magma, their sun. All this was disclosed on that one day, and conversation was about little else. Movies were made, research commissioned, curricula adjusted, spiritual zoos founded, the nudity of animals debated. This changes everything, we thought, then returned to our daily order. Now we live in the settled knowledge of the creature's gods, forgetting to imagine the world in any other way. I'm going to finish with 4 shorter poems. And the next one is from the book. And Tom, you were kind enough to share this with people online on your amazing Instagram account. We have a bird here called the jay, which you also have. I think the European jay is a little smaller, a bit cheekier, and but has that beautiful blue wing. You get a flash of blue now and then. And a little jaybird appears at significant moments for my wife and me. You just get this weird flash of blue, and it always seems to be at some kind of during some sort of significant event. So we kind of think of it as magic, although we also know it just might be coincidence. So this poem is called Blue. Sunlight, perhaps rain. A branch, leafless potential of universe. Before we can say the J is here, landing light ascent, writing herself along the open line each moment offers. Softly, we give thanks for the tension as she leaves the blue air laughing. So into each day lies everything and into night, satellite, perhaps stars. This is a poem that emerged last week. It's called This Sublime Scattering. From beyond our atmosphere, the sun appears white. So the scientists said on that podcast you like. All those egg yolk dawns, noon's goldenrod beams, log fire sunsets. Beauty is a distortion, it seems, untrue to the every colour of its source, but far closer to what we feel we are. Fallen pears. I always listen closely when you speak about those times. So lovely the way you pause, then carefully share your thoughts. Do you remember how we watched wild pears soften in the sun, concerned they might fall and lay unseen? And I think the final poem in my set, and this kind of brings me full circle because, you know, I started with Lines, which is a kind of love note from a writer to a reader, and this is a love note from a reader to a writer, a very meaty, bloody, passionate note. So it's rather like a strange twin to the poem I started with, and I think I should dedicate this to you, Tom, because you're a great writer and a great reader, and you're also a very generous host. And by coincidence, or magic, this poem is called Host. Your words are hot lamb fat, coating every atom of me. All these memories of the feast melting greasy and deep into my decreasingly efficient body and increasingly feral mind, like the living meat of a lost sheep transformed into wolf. Right. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you so much, Tim, for beautiful reading, and thank you for that last poem. I don't take that lightly. That is really awesome, and I'm very glad you read Blue too. That again was Tim Rich, who I'm going to outro, but you are not going to hear the last from Tim because we will be hearing from Tim when we have all of our burning questions for him in the Q&A. But Tim, you can find on Instagram at Tim Rich Photographs, TimRichPhotographs, and he has a website, timrich.com, where you can find all kinds of stuff. And he is available at the email from that website, tim@timrich.com. He's going to be launching an online project next year, which I'm looking forward to asking him about. in a little bit. So please, if you'd like to get in touch with him, Instagram and that email, tim@timrich.com, are a great way to do that. Awesome. I'm really, really glad that that's the note that we began on. And I'm also really excited for our next reader plus special musical guest, Eliot Cardinaux and Isaac Luxon, who I'll introduce with Eliot's bio. But I also want to note that I think Eliot and Isaac have made music before as an example. That's what Google said anyway, so I hope that's not wrong. But Eliot Cardinaux in particular, he plays piano, writes music, and writes and translates poems, not really for a living, as it happens. He is the author of On the Long Blue Night, an extraordinary full-length collection of poems from Dos Madres Press out this year, 2023, as well as numerous chapbooks and records through his label and imprint, The Bodily Press, which is putting out amazing stuff, music, poetry, and otherwise. Eliot and Isaac, thank you so much for being here with us. I'm going to take it away, and you can unmute and do your thing.
Thanks, Tom, so much for hosting us. I want to say thanks to Tim. It was a beautiful reading. I like the book-ended, writer to reader, reader to writer poems. Yeah, I know Tim a little bit from Instagram, and I know Tom from Instagram and more. I mean, we text a lot about poetry, and Isaac Luxon, we've been friends, I think, for about 20 years. We've been making music since 2012, 2010.
So about 10 years.
So 10 years, not 20 years. I'm sorry. Time doesn't exist. Shit. It's always the same time in eternity, guys. Anyway, but it's nice to be in different time zones and kind of tentatively reaching out across the Atlantic and across the gap created by how much distance we are able to cross in such a short amount of time digitally. It's kind of cool. I've been thinking about that a lot because I just got back from Europe. But Isaac and I are going to play a piece of music that I wrote called Prudent Nature. We have been known as In Example for many years. Isaac has recently come back from California, and we're playing together for the first time in quite a bit. So it's very exciting for me to have him here. I'm going to start by reading a poem, and then I'm going to walk over to the piano and we're going to play Prudent Nature together. So this poem is called Long Live the King. At the end of my biography, the goats were yelling. Up a wholesome pitch, the fever stirring across the board on which the pieces had begun to move, when in droves the goats left. Here I give this witness majesty, the whispers between sheaves, daily and daily, becoming more human, louder and louder at the end of history. Of this the goats were dreaming. Thanks. That was Prudent Nature. I wrote that, and we sort of arranged that today, kind of on the spot before the gig. So now I'm going to read a few short snippets from something that I've been working on called Notes from Bird Lake, which is yeah, I guess it's kind of an allusion to Michael Palmer's Notes from Echo Lake. Also because I've been reading his book called The Danish Notebook, and I've been traveling back and forth from Denmark recently. And something about Michael Palmer's Danish Notebook is that it's a completely open text. Like there's no resolution. That was his whole intention, and he kept feeling like he just completely failed in writing the book that he set out to write. And that's how I felt when I was trying to write this book. It was kind of an homage. I mean, he was saying he read Keith Waldrop's, can't remember the title. He mentions a couple of Keith Waldrop's books as having done what he was hoping to do in the Danish Notebook. So now I'm writing a book that's hoping to do and failing to do what the Danish Notebook does. And hopefully we can continue failing in the face of each other's brilliance for many years to come as poets and artists on this earth. So I'm going to grab this. So it's, yeah, I'm just going to grab this sheet of paper. And then we're going to do something called the 5-minute song, which the only compositional information is to try to play for exactly 5 minutes. And yeah. So this is some excerpts from notes from Bird Lake. And I'm going to read a little epigraph that I'm toying with for what's probably going to be a chapbook to start. It's from Michael Palmer's Danish Notebook. The dialogue between the near and the far, how the center empties as details accumulate, how the absent reappears and the present. That's Michael Palmer from the Danish Notebook. So I'm going to read a few things and I'm just going to swiftly transfer over to the piano. I'm sorry we don't have a perfect setup for all this. It's going to be a little DIY. Okay, this is from Notes from Bird Lake. White horse through the window, the shiver and shake of my hands. I am such a wave to wash over you. When you were falling, noise over mind, what of these misheard arrows of light in the dark of the mind, this placelessness? To whom do I refer? No one can force me to talk. Trees, too, have the right to remain silent. That one, standing alone in a field, a criminal. The wind is estranged, entangled in odious wood. Death's leaves then ignited, aimless fury, how are we satisfied? The wind encircling the space could well feed flames. to envy the Buddha's strength, fight with the warmth of the house. A spider went under her sleeve. She lends her breath to the music. We've eaten a lot of apples. Come to another bear's cave. Signs. There's that refrain again. If fears were allowed to live, there would be rhetoric to control it. This music from another room. Till morning, then, in a newer town, all this strangeness in the dark. Thanks. That was the 5-minute song. How'd we do? Was that close? We're close to 5 minutes?
A little over.
It was a little over, but it's hard to be,
Hard to be exact.
we're all following the Roman calendar to the best of our abilities. I think that's sort of like all we got for the day. I hope it wasn't too short. I only got the 5-minute part. The rest of it I didn't really measure. So
That's a beautiful place to segue into our conversation space, if that's okay. And I would just like to apologize to both of you in advance because I feel like Zoom may have been fighting you in a couple of moments. But the original Sound for Musicians thing is on in my screen, so we'll see how it came out in the recording, and you can tell me how that all looks, because we were hearing a good amount of it, and then I had a few moments where I think Zoom was beating you down. So I'm very interested in this, especially I want to talk a little bit about what Tim mentioned about, like, there's, the fact that we're in this kind of algorithmically generated space together that is allowing us to share some things but not allowing us to share other things. There's a lot of questions, I think, about this that I think we could ask, and I want to invite Tim back into the conversation as well. So Tim, feel free to unmute yourself, etc., as we do in this sort of Q&A phase. The first thing I kind of just wanted to ask both of you, Eliot and Tim, about your work, because we've heard some music now from Eliot, and Tim, you mentioned sharing some photographs as well with your poems. I'm just really curious because I'm like an all poetry all the time kind of person, but I really am interested in the place that poetry exists in for you all as not your only artistic practice. So I wonder if maybe starting with Tim and then over to Eliot, like what does it mean for you to like write a poem versus take a photograph or write a piece of music? How do these things kind of sit together for you? So Tim, do you want to say a few words, and then maybe Eliot and Isaac, if you want to jump in after that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I sort of rather pretentiously describe my photography as lo-fi photography. An absolutely brilliant term which I've coined and will continue to use until it's picked up and goes viral. But it's basically, I'm using an iPhone, and my photography is very much what I see out and about, and is often kind of very tight framing on reality. So, for example, by coincidence, an example behind me, I've been photographing boat hulls that are on the harbour. So old boats that are kind of have just been turned upside down to dry, and they have these beautiful markings where the fiberglass or the wood has been scratched away by all of the friction that they've encountered. So I get in really close and photograph those and create sort of abstract pieces. And the bit for me where it starts to get really interesting is it was from doing that I got the inspiration to write a poem called Landfall, which picked up on just really what happens to those boats when they go out to sea. And then I got an invitation to exhibit at the Bloomsbury Festival in London, and it just felt like a lovely way to bring the photographs and the poetry together. And it raised a really interesting question for me in terms of the poetry, which is, how do you do justice to poetry in an exhibition setting? And, quite often, most of the time, in fact, my words are, online or in a digital form, or sometimes if they're printed out, it's in a smaller format, and sometimes that can be very beautiful, and sometimes it can be very workmanlike. So it raised lots of questions about the aesthetics of poetry and how it can live. So I went to a letterpress designer and printer in London, and we worked together to create a letterpress print of the poem on some very beautiful German paper. And just working in letterpress creates a different kind of process poetically. Well, first of all, I've never proofed and sub-edited a poem like it, because you really don't want to create a typo when you're going to be working in a very old form of printing, which is completely unforgiving. So I think I got about 10 people to read it, and it produced something which I was really pleased with. And then I did a run of 100 prints, which then I've been selling, but also giving as gifts. And what then also came from that is I'm looking for really interesting places where I can exhibit. So where I can put the poem with the photographs and maybe bring in other poems. And there's an old pub in my road, which is just now a home, which has these beautiful Victorian windows. And I just went to the people that live there and said, hey, do you fancy me doing an exhibition there? And they said, yeah, we would absolutely love that. We can take down our Halloween display from 2 years ago, and you can take over. And 300 or 400 people walk past every day, often with their dogs or their children. And it's a way of finding getting poetry in front of people in new ways in their life, where they go unusual places, in the nooks and crannies of life. And that's what is exciting me more and more. And that process all started from photographs.
That's awesome.
Sorry
Yeah,
to interrupt.
yeah, that reminds me a lot of like the William Bronk. Like he would send those postcards to family and friends of just like single poems and stuff. And Elliot, I wanted to ask you because I feel like you're another like in your work, especially like for spoken word and music, like that puts, for example, as you just did in this performance, like a poem in either close contact or direct overlay with music. You don't need to talk about just that particular part of your practice, but like that has always struck me as kind of a way of almost spatializing the poems or giving them a new kind of home, like Tim was talking about, but also any way that this kind of sits for you. I'd love to hear a little bit more about.
Yeah, I mean, I think music creates kind of an environment, almost a natural environment for the poem. One of my mentors, Peter Gizzi, described my music, where I'm also reading poems, as a voice in weather. I mean, he's really big on weather and landscape, and the voice kind of coming up against the weather of the world, of history. But I think in that sense, it really does kind of give it a sense that the voice is up against something, it's supported by something, yeah, I mean, it's kind of, I mean, you can kind of think it like of it as a voice, the lyric, originally being connected to music and all that. But I think also for me, poetry comes initially from a desire to put music into words, not necessarily to say something, but to speak in a way that is musical to me. I think it also maybe comes down to this notion that sometimes I felt that instrumental music was limiting because I couldn't name things in it. I couldn't speak to anything in it. I couldn't.
It doesn't have a language.
It is a language, but it's not language. Like there's a whole Adorno essay on, the similarities and dissimilarities between language and music, which I think is, those are good questions to ask. Is music actually a language? Does it does it communicate something specific? Does poetry communicate something specific? Or does it communicate something that can't be communicated any other way? So I think music and poetry were always kind of like, they were like different ways of going about the same thing, or they were different parts of one thing working together. So I think, yeah, for me also music takes me to many places. I tour much more as a musician than I do as a poet, but then I started bringing my poetry into that sphere. And so when I'm performing and reading my poetry or doing spoken word in the midst of a performance, I'm also inhabiting a space like, say, Denmark, where I just got back from, and writing in the times that I'm not on stage, or when I have time to myself to be with the essential solitude that my writing demands of me, or holds over me in some instances. Like I have to write. It's almost like I don't have a. I think it was Blanchot that said, "Writing does not belong to writers. Writers belong to writing, to their writing." That it is kind of like playing an instrument for me. That it's like sitting down and improvising, and like a recording, written language offers us to offer at least a document of that moment where that writing took place. And that's how it, invariably reaches another person through their ears, through their heart, mind, sense of language. But I recently got back from Denmark, and those poems, Notes from Bird Lake, were written in and around the town of Fuglsø in Mols, which is a region in Denmark in Jutland. And Fuglsø means bird lake. And I guess that's where the kind of whole Michael Palmer things sort of fit together with Echo Lake, but Fuglsø is bird lake, so it made sense. And I wanted them to be notes on the experience of also being around people who were not primarily speaking English amongst each other, where you're in a country where another language is spoken and suddenly your relationship to language changes. And the absence of my mother tongue in those instances, how do you write when you're not hearing words in English spoken around you? A lot of my poetry comes from the world. And so trying to weigh, meanings like Fuglsø, bird lake. There are other. Aarhus became year house, which is a literal translation. There are also words that kind of translate literally as different thing, like butterfly is basically summer bird in Danish. And so these kind of minglings of languages, I think I took a leaf out of Pierre Jory's book and talked about mother tongue, other tongue, lover tongue. And so music like puts me in a position to be in a country like Denmark. So it's like there's a whole extra musical, extra poetic series of coincidences that occur by virtue of me being a musician or a poet.
I think it raises also lots of really really interesting questions when you're bringing two things together, because I spend a lot of time trying to make sure that if I combine words and image in some way, that it's not literal in a dead way. And it's hard to just get that balance where somehow the image and the words are bouncing off one another to create something that is more together, rather than a poem becoming sort of like an earnest caption to a photograph, or a photograph becoming a secondary illustration to a poem. And that's lovely. I mean, it's a wonderful creative challenge, and working out how you try to get that resonance and how that works. And imagine it's the same with music. Hey, I mean, when I was playing music, I was a drummer, so I'm not sure whether I'm allowed opinions on
Yes. Yeah, you are. Yeah,
drums are very useful for poetry, I could say. But I can imagine with music at the same time also you're avoiding this kind of the words and the voice and the music having a sort of obvious literal reinforcement. The tension and friction is where it begins to get exciting. And then
like Peter and the Wolf were always talked about how Tune represents, of course. I mean, was Prokofiev really sitting there like, yes, and the Wolf's voice? I mean, there are great recordings of like people playing along with human voices. Like I think Jason Moran does this piece called "Ringing My Phone," straight out of Istanbul, and it's like this Turkish woman speaking on the phone, and he's just playing all those pitches, and then he loops it and creates this crazy vamp out of it. And the rhythms are not like something typically you'd see on the grid. So it's almost like taking an element that's outside of that grid and adapting it to the grid. Or
You just brought me to seeing when Jeff Mangum toured after Neutral Milk Hotel was getting back together. It was, I forget which quartet, but they did the Gavin Bryars Jesus Blood Never Failed Me Yet, which is that like a quartet accenting and playing along with the Jesus Blood Never Failed Me Yet, which was like picked up on a tape recorder incidentally that he had like left on in the studio. Somebody was just walking by and singing Jesus Blood Never Failed Me Yet, never failed.
yeah,
That's beautiful. I wanted to pick up, I think it was Eliot you just said earlier, this note, this question of like solitude, because for both of you, I see you and I think of you, whether I hope this is a good thing, but like I think of you as poets of love and attention, like in love and careful attention. And I do in my life feel like solitude kind of helps with that sometimes, because it allows you sometimes to Rocanly kind of focus on that one thing. But also I'm really struck by how well both of you enter into conversation with things that are not just, you know, the between the ears type thing. Like I was thinking about, Tim, your poem in conversation with ancient Egyptian history, and Eliot, I think too, of your work translating and thinking about like this, like almost having like a world literary moment. And like you've mentioned, bringing in other languages. I guess I'm just kind of wondering how, when you're, you know, I don't think this is a thing you do in the abstract, like I think it's something you do when you hear, like Eliot, you're in a situation or something comes from, like Tim, you see a boat hull and you're like, I'm going to take a picture of that right now. But I am just kind of curious how that solitude, how those two like poles, if they're poles, play with each other in your thinking about poetry and other art, like the difference between needing to maybe be alone and have quiet, but also always kind of waiting for that other voice or that other thing to enter into it, if that makes sense.
I would speak to the fact that music is an inherently collaborative art form. I mean, I think poetry couldn't exist on its own. Poets can't exist without other readers, other poets, dead poets. I mean, there's always a sense of dialogue and community, even among, you know, those who have long passed on. It's the same in music. I mean, I listen to a lot of Charlie Parker. Isaac was sharing with me My Melancholy Baby, this track that has Monk and Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. I mean, it's like insane that we have that to listen to. But I also think that for me, like, I need to be careful not to get too wrapped up in my writing world and forget that I have this access to something that's more kind of shared in the moment. I mean, giving a reading can be like that, or opening this dialogue. But I think I have to be very mindful of the fact that that place is easy for me to go to, but I have to be able to come out of it. That like internal, deep internal focus. I don't want every concert that I play for the rest of my life to be a solo performance just so I can control every element of it. Like, I don't want for my poetry to become dead on the page because I don't want to let anything in. So I think that's important for me to remember.
Yeah, and the same. I mean, I think you have to be careful. What are you soaking up? And I mean, today I felt that I wanted to share two poems that were particularly about writing and reading. But generally, I'm careful not to end up writing too many poems that are about poems and poetry. And I think they have their place and they're wonderful. And I do write them sometimes, and I do put them in a special drawer. And I think, you know, they can be wonderful, those things. And I think the act of poetry and the poetry as expression is also often a beautiful sub-theme that runs underneath so many poems beautifully. But I generally kind of prefer for it to be there. And I'm kind of careful to try to be soaking up everything, and thinking that it might emanate in a way that's kind of right for poetry. And that comes down, you know, when I was saying in The Extinction of the Wild Bears of Ireland, when there was a man on the radio talking about those bears, that was literal. I mean, that was there was a program on the radio which was absolutely brilliant and took me. And my short poem about the sun being white and beauty actually is a distortion was coming from a podcast I was listening to while driving up the motorway. And even though I was railing against the digital world somewhat in my piece about Osiris, of course, this digital world that we have access to is completely wonderful in terms of the richness of sources and the things you're soaking up. And also, well, look at tonight, but also just your ability to access things. So, I'm very aware of what I'm going to experience and what that might mean. But actually, for the first time, I'm going to do something self-consciously as a trip to somewhere with the main purpose that I'm hoping it somehow comes into my poetry. And I've never done that before. I used to work in art galleries, and so I'm going to some galleries over the next couple of weeks with the main purpose of going into some particular rooms there, some quite quiet rooms, and really getting very deep into some of the paintings that are there and seeing what comes out from that. That process has already inspired me a little bit in terms of poetry, but I'm doing that in a very particular way. Now, listen, at the end of that, it might not work, or they might just feel forced, or it might just be the worst poems that emerge initially. But I know something is going to come from that process. Something is going to come from it. But I've just never done it quite in such a self-conscious way. So we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, that's really odd. First of all, I wish you the best of looking. And I feel like this is maybe a forceful segue, but like one of the things that you mentioned early in your response there was like the internet and connectivity. And, I'm lucky to know both of you through the internet. But also, as we know, for every connection that you make on a place like Instagram, your experience is also algorithmically mediated in a way that shoves your eyes towards stuff that you might not want to see, or that, does this almost short-circuiting sometimes. And I guess like I'm trying to put it into a question, but I'm really just going to like say it, and I'm sure you all will have brilliant things to say. But it's like I feel very frequently, as somebody who shares poetry on these sorts of platforms, that there's this kind of tension between the kind of time and space, like Tim, you mentioned, just like sitting in front of a painting for a long time, or like Eliot being at a piano for a long enough to make something happen. Like that kind of attention sometimes feels at odds with what happens when you enter something like a poem into the digital stream, right? Which makes it somehow possible to scroll by in an instant. It doesn't mean that everybody does that, but it does open that possibility. And I guess I'm just a little bit curious, like, whether it's a question of like, how do you self-preserve so that you get to like pay attention to those things? Or like, Eliot, how do you find those gems like that you mentioned, finding some new bird stuff that you had not heard before or something? Like, I'm just really interested in like how you, it's almost like a protection thing, like how you protect that part, that kind of attention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a strange thing. I think for me, there are a lot of journals that say you can't submit here if the poems the poems you submit here can never have appeared on social media. That's one thing for me where it's like, is it really worth it for me to put this poem up on social media and get like, for one, like the endorphin rush of seeing people like it, or the letdown of people not liking this one as much as they like the other one for, like you said, some random algorithmic reason, or like something caught on, and it I don't think online criteria like likes and visibility are really any indication of a poem's. I don't think they can be, because it doesn't work that way. A poem's success, But I do kind of feel like, I mean, there's one thing about the social media thing with poetry is that you are able to connect with other poets in a way where like you suddenly realize you're not the only one doing this. And I think for a long time for me, it's felt like there weren't poets living on this planet the way I wanted to be a poet. And I mean, it took me years of like, finding a mentor who was like, come and hear this panel on John Wieners with Fannie Howe and Jim Dunn and Garrett Lansing. I was like, whoa, these are like real people who knew these real people who are like famous poets. And I think like, especially maybe for younger poets, I mean, I'm getting close to 40, so I'm hardly able to claim that I'm a younger poet anymore. But I do think there's something to be said for the community that has built up around pages like your own, Tom, where you have this not just sharing your own work, but sharing either poems or excerpts of poems by all kinds of writers, authors, poets, many of whom I've never come across, because it can be a hard, kind of world to break into, to understand where do you find this stuff. And I work at a bookstore, and you still show me poets whose names I've maybe only heard in passing, and I get to see their work. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's one facet of the way we're able to share stuff. I don't think it's sufficient. Do I think it's problematic? I mean, yeah, probably a little bit. But I also am able to put my poems onto the page, and I have the small press, and I do chapbooks. And if I'm lucky enough to get a full length accepted somewhere and have a book come out, then people have the opportunity to see something in a larger context. So I think of the um, Instagram post as kind of like my drawing board, and I try to make that process at least accessible enough to people that they can see maybe, you posted the same poem, but it's different now, or like however much people decide they want to follow those, little updates. It doesn't really matter. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's the world we live in, and it's pretty hard to just like say, I'm not going to do that anymore. I mean, I think, there's different people have different reasons for whether they may or may not share their stuff on social media. Um, I think it's kind of a matter of where you're at, and what works for you at a particular time. And I don't know. I mean, it feels like, there's definitely a quality of addiction I have to these platforms. I'm not going to lie. It's like, every day. Hey,
I think that's a really, yeah. I think that's a really really key point. I completely agree with what you're saying about the wonderful sharing and community and the access. And again, Tom, what you're creating there, I think it's good. I think we just have to really, really take care of our minds, and everyone always has had to do this, and we have to as well, and we just have to keep just clocking into kind of what are we spending time with. And you talked about love and attention earlier, which was a lovely phrase, and I think this is the thing that you need to do with your own mind. And I think I'm just going into a little phase at the moment, having spent a lot of time working on online projects and meeting a lot of people online, which has been brilliant. And also now just going into a phase of spending a lot of time in person with people, quietly, talking to them about their life, and away from that digital world as well. And we just have to keep clocking in on that, because if you don't do that, suddenly the poetry just becomes a bit dry, I think. That's my experience anyway. So yeah, it's a blessing, but we just have to keep taking care.
Hey, Isaac, how you doing? Still there?
I'm still here.
I was gonna say, I know that our musicians they are tasked with getting packed up and out of their space in T minus 16 to 17 minutes. So I think on Tim's note of taking care and being part of this beautiful world, I think we will probably leave our reading and conversation just about there. And I want to conclude just by saying a couple of quick things, mostly of thanks to Tim and Eliot and Isaac for being here with us. this evening. And to everybody who's on the Zoom call with us, thank you for listening. And if you're listening on YouTube, thank you for doing that as well. I just want to remind folks that if you are listening with a bunch of poems and you want to share them with us, we would love to hear from you at Nightlight Poems on Twitter, a bunch more underscores on Instagram, or just get in touch with me. It would be great to have you. We have an event coming up on the solstice, so the third Thursday of December is the 21st. I was looking forward to that, and there's a lineup sort of brewing, and then gearing up to do some cool readings and hopefully more conversations in the new year as well. And I do want to close, because we always do, with a poem to end things. This is from this really lovely anthology that I wish more people would read. It's American Poetry or American Poems Since 1970, Up Late, edited by Andrei Codrescu. And this is a poem by Alice Notley. It's called World's Bliss. The men and women sang and played, they sleep by singing. What shall I say of the most poignant on earth, the most glamorous, loneliest, sought-after people, those poets, wholly beautiful, desolate, aureate? Death is a powerful, instinctive emotion. But who would be released from a silver skeleton? Gems and drinking cups. This skull is Helen. Who would not be released from the book of knowledge? Why should a maiden lie on a moor for 7 nights and a day? And he is a maiden, he is, and she on the grass, the flower, the spray, where they lie eating primroses, grown crazy with sorrow and all the beauties of old. Oh, each poet's a beautiful human girl who must die.